Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we've got some more 1850L to build. We've got the chassis rails put together with the servos attached that completed bag A, so that can only mean we're on to bag B and the front axle. There's lots of good bits in bag B. We've got the axle, which of course is metal, the damper bodies. Now I say damper, the stock ones are really just there for looks, but Tamiya do a set of proper oil dampers. But they really don't add much to the way that the trucks run. Here are the leaf springs, which are properly riveted together, unlike the Hercules Hobbies truck, where they were loose with the rivet just in the bottom of the bag. It wasn't a huge issue, but it's nicer to have them ready to fit. Next, there's a bag with all the shoulder screws, and lastly, the bag with the U-bolts and the mounts. Okay, here we go then. Step 8, building the non-damping dampers. We'll be needing the 4 damper shafts, 4 springs, 4 bodies, and 4 C17 plastic spacers. We're also going to need 4 C3 rod ends when we get there. What we do first is pop one of the spacers over the shaft so it's ready to pop into the body. But since this is a metal sliding on metal situation, specifically sliding in aluminium, we need to make sure it's suitably lubricated. The ceramic grease the kit comes with will do the job. You just need to keep in mind that it will dry out after a couple of years. To open the tube we just need to poke the end with something sharp, but be aware it'll probably be under a bit of pressure, so once you puncture it, well, you can come up with your own slightly dodgy joke here. To be safe, just have a tissue at the ready. Now it's open, we just need to run some around the shaft so there's a good bit on there, and we can just pop it through the body. We follow it with one of the springs, then screw on the cap. On some of the trucks it's better to run without the springs, but I'm thinking once the cab and the metal sides on the box are on, it's going to be pretty weighty, so I think we're going to use them. Now, to fit the rod ends, I tend to grab the shaft with some pliers, with cardboard to protect the rod of course, then screw the rod end on. However, that's not quite what Tamiya had in mind. The top of the damper shaft has a Phillips head, so you can actually use a screwdriver. I find using a screwdriver just slightly more fiddly, trying to balance all the parts and hold the screwdriver. I suppose with a short stubby driver it might be a bit easier though. The important thing is we don't want to damage the shaft. It's going to wear a bit as it is, and if it's scraped up it's going to eat the aluminium body even quicker. Build 4 with your chosen method and we're done with step 8. Okay, step 9 next, adding the dampers and hangers to the chassis, which means we'll need 2 of the dampers. The other 2 come in when we do the rear axle. We're going to need 2 damper collars, 4 shackle plates, 2 shoulder screws, 2 M3 lock nuts, 2 M3 flange nuts, and 2 M3x12s. For plastic bits there's 2 F1s, the large spacers, and there's 2 F15s, the thin spacers. Since we're attaching this lot to the chassis, we will be needing the chassis too. Just as a diagram, we'll have it front end to the right and upside down. Starting with the shackles, we need one of the shoulder screws, then we pop a shackle plate on, one of the big spacers, another shackle plate, then one of the thin spacers. The assembly then goes through the hole that's between the steering servo and the crank. On the inside, we just use one of the M3 nuts to attach it, which is easier said than done. It's just a little too close to the edge of the rail to fit the standard cross wrench. Now a small spanner would work, but they're a bit awkward. Now a good pair of pliers, preferably parallel jaws, does make life nice and simple. You can grip the nut, stopping it from spinning, as well as stabilise the chassis just with one hand, and then you can tighten the screw with the other. Now because Tamiya got the tolerances just right, we can screw it up all the way and still have the shackles move nice and freely. The shoulder on the screw is just slightly longer than the combined width of all the shackle bits. Repeat on the other side, and that's the shackles on, ready for the leaf springs in a couple of steps. Okay, dampers next, and all we need to do is pop one of the collars into the top of the damper and pass one of the screws through. Now the screw head needs to go on the short side of the collar against the top of the damper. Then we just offer it up to the damper mount and use one of the flange nuts on the back. The screw, the collar and the nut are all steel, so you can really tighten them up nice and tight. The grippy bits on the nut will dig into the mount and it will happily stay put. But if you want to go all belts and braces, you can use a tiny bit of thread lock too, just to make sure that they really won't fall out. Repeat, and we've got 2 dampers ready to go. Now you may have noticed we were also supposed to clip the short linkage onto the bottom of the crank, but I missed that while building. It doesn't matter much though, and I do notice it's missing before it's too late. Step 10. Adding the leaf springs to the axle. We're going to need 3 of the silver 5mm ball ends, the 4 U-bolts, 2 spring seats, 2 damper stays, 3 M3 plain nuts, 8 M3 flange nuts, and 2 M3x6s. For the plastic bits we need an E8 and an E9. Now these are sided, so try to keep track of which is which. In addition to all those bits, we also need the axle itself and the 2 leaf springs. Okay, we're going to start by popping the ball ends into the plastic uprights. The top of the 2 just needs a ball end fitting in the longer of the 2 arms. All we do is pop a nut into the hex hole and thread in the ball end from the other side. The other one is the same, except this time we installed 2 ball ends. Now these are good candidates for swapping the plain nuts for more nylocks. They do have a tendency to come loose after some time, and because the plastic is really thin, using thread lock is a bit of a risk. If the plastic goes brittle, it's not going to survive for very long. Okay, axle next, which has a right way round. One side has some threaded holes to mount the damper mounts. However, the leaf springs don't have a right way round, so we don't need to worry about it at the moment. Because the leaf packs have the rivets correctly installed, they locate very nicely on the axles, and they don't have a habit of sliding away. From the top of the axle, we need to drop 2 of the U-bolts over the leaf springs, so they're tight against the axle. Then we need to hold them in position and flip the axle over. Now from the threaded side, we pop one of the plates over the threads and start spinning on the flange nuts. Now the plate has a hole in the middle that locates over a post on the axle, so you have to work really hard to misalign something. For now we'll just do the nuts up finger tight plus a bit with the wrench. We still want the leaves to be able to move a bit so we can get the damper mounts in, and so when we offer it up to the chassis we can get the leaf pack straight in the shackles. Now as you might expect, the other leaf pack fits in exactly the same way, so rather than go over it again, here it is done, much quicker. That just leaves the damper mounts. They pop in over the leaf springs and mount to the axle with M3 screws. If there's no hole for them to screw into, you've almost certainly got the axle the wrong way round. It's usually a good idea to use a little bit of thread lock on these. They do tend to work their way loose over time. However, I'm planning to do a mod for some more steering lock after the truck's built, which involves modifying the mounts. So we will leave the screws dry for now, so they're easier to take out. Step 11, hanging the axle, and this one's very straightforward, although access is a bit limited here and there. All we need is 6 shoulder screws and 6 M3 nylock nuts, along with the axle and the chassis. Right, the axle wants to be offered up to the shackles on the chassis. Now because we left the nuts on the U-bolts lightly tightened, we can fiddle with the ends of the springs to get them to fit nicely. Also remembering that the damper mounts need to be at the front of the axle. Once the front of the leaf springs are in, pop a couple of the shoulder screws in and thread on a couple of nuts. We only need to do them up just far enough that they're not going to fall out. Next we've got the rear shackles. Well, they're a bit more fiddly as they're in 2 parts that swing around, but get them lined up and the shoulder screw should go straight through. Pop a couple of nuts on so they don't fall out. Now those 4 are in, we can go around and tighten them properly. Now the nuts can be done up so they're fully home on the threads. They do have a bit of a tendency to pinch the shackle plates between the nut and the shoulder though, making them feel like they're done all the way up. Just give the suspension a jiggle and they'll pop back out and you can tighten the nut up the rest of the way. The front screw next to the shift servo arm is a bit of a hassle to get at. A small spanner would be ideal, but you can get away with some pliers in a pinch. You have to grip fairly tightly or the nut will spin in the jaws, causing a bit of damage. Nip up all 4 and we can install the screws for the bottom of the dampers. We'll just use more or less the same method. Line up the bottom of the damper, pop the screw in and do up the nuts. Okay, now for the bit an awful lot of builders miss, getting the leaf springs nicely lined up. First we'll loosen the U-bolt nuts so the springs are free to move around. I'm also going to loosen the lower damper mounts too, as they can restrict the leaf springs. Now we can give all the bits on the axle a nice bit of a jiggle. The idea is to let everything find its own position. Next, very gently so we don't disturb anything, we need to take up the slack on the flange nuts. Then continue to tighten them a little bit at a time until they're all fully home. Using the good old cross tightening pattern is the best. It will help make sure the plates go down nice and square. So that just leaves retightening the damper mounts, do them up, and the axle is hung. If it's all gone well, the axle should have a little bit of slop in the suspension. You can see with very little force the leaf springs are knocking about in the shackles. Now it would be nicer if there was a little less slop, but with this design, if there's less slop, it means the metal parts are going to be rubbing, causing wear. What it really wants are some proper poly bushes in the ends of the springs, but that's pushing it a bit for a 1/14 scale truck. Step 12, fitting the steering bits. Now we're going to need the remains of bag B, the upright shafts and the kingpins, along with two 2mm E-clips. We're also going to need the 2 uprights and all of the linkages. Now it was about now I noticed I hadn't fitted the short linkage, so we'll do that first. It's a little more awkward now with the axle fitted, but it's still doable. It just needs to clip onto the bottom of the crank so the other end's ready to clip onto the upright. Okay, first proper job on step 12, we need to pop one of the upright shafts into an upright. There's a hole on the big end that needs to line up with the holes in the upright for the kingpin. We need to squirt a little bit of grease down the hole, which we can make sure actually goes where we need it by pushing some in with a kingpin. Next we offer it up to the axle. Now remember the uprights are sided, so get the right one. Also make sure that the long arm goes towards the front. When in position, one of the kingpins should go straight through from the top, which is the bottom as you look at it because the chassis is actually upside down. Then on the top we just need to clip in one of the E-clips. When it's on, it should move completely freely. If not, something went wrong and it needs looking at. The other side is exactly the same, of course, so while that goes together we'll talk about steering slop. So one of Tamiya's famous things, other than on some of their racing chassis, is they always have a massive amount of slop. All the rod ends are just slightly sloppy, which adds up on its own. But these 1/14 scale kits also have an issue where the upright shaft is a little bit loose in the plastic upright, causing quite a bit of slop on its own. You can help the rod ends by simply replacing them with better ones. I tend to go for Traxxas, but many others are available. Generally, if they're a brand name one, they're going to be quite a bit better. For the uprights, there's aftermarket axles with better designs. I've come across one with some proper nylon bushes in the ends of the axle that do look rather good. But I think if we were to add a spot of epoxy on the end of the shaft before fitting it inside the plastic and then pushing it in, then maybe drill out the hole to clear any excess epoxy, it might get rid of quite a lot of the slop. I've not tried it yet, but we might have a go when we modify the steering for more lock. Anyway, that just leaves clipping the linkages on, and at this stage it's pretty obvious where they go. The long one goes across the front, and we need to clip the short one on the only ball end that's left. Very nice. So that's bag B complete then, but before we go we'll run up the steering servo on the servo tester and see how it all moves. Okay, at first glance it all looks okay, but at full lock we're only using about half the servo travel. It's going to work okay, but we're not going to be getting the most from the servo. When we modify things it's going to go a little bit further, but it won't make up the difference. So what I'll do before the rest of the front structure goes on the chassis is move the ball end on the top of the crank assembly to the outside hole. It should be enough to get the servo running end to end nicely. Right, so that's it for this week then. As always, thanks for watching. Like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!